Good morning, everyone. I'm Son In-ju, a professor and deputy director, Institute for Future Strategy at Seoul National University. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm very delighted to moderate this first panel discussions. Our speakers will speak in person to audience here, and also we webcast live to the audience around the world. This forum comes at an important moment. There is growing international awareness of the significance of the intense technology competition between United States and China, and its implication for evolving world order, including the global supply chain. Our panelists will provide a deep understanding about US-China technological competition and a restructuring of global supply chain that has emerged in the past few years. It's stunning in scope and speed. And there are also heated debates over Republic of Korea's position and response to these new global dynamics. To discuss this topic, we have an outstanding panel today. We have three back-to-back presentations. Each speaker is supposed to give about 20 minutes talk, followed by the comments and remarks by our designated discussant. Then I will moderate the question and answer with the audience. Two-way simultaneous interpretation is available at this forum all day long, as I understanding. So feel free to speak 한국어 or English. So now let me please introduce our speakers and discussant. First of all, our first speaker, William Bonvillian, is a senior director at the Office of Digital Learning of Massachusetts Institute for Technology. He is one of the leading influential figures in US in this field. His new book, Workforce Education New Roadmap, was released last year by MIT Press. On top of that, he is the author of four prominent books on innovation policy. And he also took a lot of various leadership positions, including serving on National Academies of Science Board on Materials and Manufacturing, and is a standing committee for its Innovation Policy Forum, and also serving NS Committee, chaired the Committee on Science Engineering Policy at the American Association for Advancement Science for 4 years. Second speaker is Dr. Choi Byung-il, President of Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies and also Professor of Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Women University. Dr. Choi is a distinguished scholar in the field of international trade and US-China relations. He took various leadership roles, including President of Korea Economic Research Institute, and also is a think tank representing Korean business sector. He also served as a president for Korea International Economic Association and the president of Korea Association for Trade and Industry Studies. Prior to joining academia, he was a Korean chief negotiator for the WTO Basic Telecommunications. Next speaker is Jung Dae-jin, Deputy Minister for Trade at the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. He is in charge of Korean ROK policy during this field. He served at the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy as a Director General for Industry, responsible for enhancing industrial competitiveness, and also Director General for Investment, supporting domestic foreign investment. Also in charge of implementing trade policies. He received his MA degree and bachelor degree economics from Seoul National University. Our third speaker, Jung Dae-jin. Our designated discussant is Jung Chul, Dr. Jung Chul, a senior research fellow at Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, and also vice chair of the Korean National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperations. He has served as a senior vice president at KIEP until year 2020. In the government, Dr. Chung has served as a member of a Presidential Commission on Policy Planning of the Republic of Korea and Senior Trade Advisor to Minister of Trade, Industry, Energy, as well as member of a long-term strategy committee chaired by Deputy Prime Minister. And Dr. Chung also worked with the Korea Embassy in the United States and U.S. Chamber of Commerce on ratification of Korea-U.S. FTA as a chief economist of Korea International Trade Association. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, William Vaughan Williams. Please.
Let me first thank the sponsors of this conference. I'm privileged to be here and greatly appreciate the invitation to share thinking and ideas with you today. I want to discuss kind of emerging U.S. policies on what I'd like to call industrial innovation policy, and perhaps give some sense, I think, of where these issues now stand in the United States, because a great deal, as you all know, has been evolving. So let me give a brief context here. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, in the post-war period, the U.S. really organized its governmental support system for innovation around a basic research stage. So in 1945, the United States was indeed the world manufacturing leader. It didn't have to think about manufacturing. Its capacity was very deep, but it was still catching up on basic research. Coming into World War II, countries like Germany or Britain had significantly stronger basic research systems. That's something which began to get built in the course of the war, but needed expansion. So in 1945, the government reached a conclusion that the governmental role was to support basic research, filling in a gap in the US innovation system. And we evolved, I think as many of you are familiar with, we evolved kind of a pipeline theory of technology development. We separated science out. The governmental role was to support science, and industry would pick up the follow-on stages. So science indeed was kind of treated as a separate actor with governmental support, and we moved from a much more integrated model in the course of the war to a really disaggregated model in the post-war period. So this model, put together by one of our science leaders at the time, Vannevar Bush, really institutionalized what we could call the valley of death, the gap between basic research and applied research. And in the US, there's comparatively few bridging mechanisms between the two sides. And let me turn to, I think, a major driver that's underlying a lot of current US policy, which is the US manufacturing decline, which has really been ongoing since about 1970. As I said before, after World War II, the US was a world manufacturing leader. Then it focused its innovation system on R&D. It did not focus it on manufacturing. That was not the problem. That was not the gap. The US developed research-led innovation in this pipeline model that I referred to earlier. Other countries, Germany, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, developed manufacturing-led innovation. The US has not done that. So the United States lost 1/3 of its manufacturing jobs and shut down 60,000 factories between 2000 and 2020. And as everyone in this room understands, the US and China have in effect traded manufacturing places. So China produced almost 30% of world manufacturing output in 2019, pre-COVID, while the US produced some 16%, which is a reversal of the numbers a couple of decades earlier. Manufacturing decline created really major social disruption in the United States. So we have an increasing problem with economic inequality in the US, as opposed to its long history of economic convergence. That's a festering problem in the US for the last 15 years. So my colleague at MIT, David Otter, has a barbell symbol for what's been going on in US society. So in this barbell, in the left bell, there's a growing, very successful, more successful than ever, upper middle class. The middle class itself has been thinning out. And a significant part of that middle class has been pushed into the other bell, a growing lower end services sector, right? With much less secure jobs, with much lower wage base. That has led to deep societal disruption in the United States. Obviously, the US has got a whole generation of famous IT-related companies, Google, Apple, others. But those firms have created, generally speaking, comparatively limited employment in the United States. This is a picture of this evolving economic inequality in the United States. So you see the long history of convergence, which stretched past the post-war era and really stretches well before that. But you can see, starting in the 1980s, really, a real divide between working class compensation and the status of the upper middle class. You can see that split. And that's been driving this whole problem of economic disruption. That's been driving the growing antipathy between our political parties. Donald Trump understood this divide. He essentially created a new political party around that stagnating incomes in the working class. He was able to obtain substantial control over an historic Republican Party that was devoted to free trade, which has now completely reversed its policies along those lines. So this manufacturing decline has had profound social ramifications in the US. It's driving a period of real political disruption in the United States. So what's evolved since this decline? So the US has looked, and this really regards industrial policy kinds of issues, the US has looked at various models reaching further down the innovation pipeline to make the connections between R&D and implementation. How far down the innovation pipeline should the US federal government's role go? And we have two universes here. We have a universe that's led by our traditional strong science agencies, the National Science Foundation, the Office of Science at the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, and various other organizations. They support, as this pipeline demonstrates, research and early stage development. Our Defense Department has a much more connected system and supports research and development, but for defense-related technologies will also support prototyping, demonstration, test bed, production, market stages. So in effect, the United States is running two innovation systems here in parallel, one for the non-defense economy and one for, obviously, the much smaller defense economy. So we've had 5 periods historically where the US has attempted to better connect the two sides of that valley of death, the science and technology development, technology implementation sides. I've talked about that first period, the post-war period, when we moved from a wartime connected economy to a more disconnected set of connections. A second period was around the Sputnik period, 1957, 1958, where we attempted to, on the defense side in particular, better connect the two sides of that valley of death. And that's when DARPA was created. That's when NASA, the Space Administration, was created. Those new agencies, which were much more connected, came along as a result of this need. A third period was in the 1980s, a competitiveness period over manufacturing, particularly with Japan, but also with Germany to some extent. A whole series of new, more connected federal programs of small size came about in that period. Really in the mid-2000, 2010 kind of period. A fourth era was around the growing climate and energy challenge. And during this period, we created a whole series of new entities in our Department of Energy to try and cope with the climate crisis, the need for new energy technologies. I've listed some of these here. A fifth period, we'll see, came around the recognition that the U.S. has got a deep problem with implementing advanced manufacturing. The U.S. launched 16 manufacturing institutes. Pending legislation will probably create several more. Of course, as my Fraunhofer colleagues understand, we borrowed a lot of their ideas in putting this program together, but it began to be a focus on the innovation side of manufacturing. So those are past policies. And we need to define industrial policy, and I just wanted to define it very simply and make a distinction here. But industrial innovation policy we can define in terms of those well-known stages that a technology must advance through. That pipeline list I discussed before, from research and development to prototyping to testing, demonstration, and actual product development, financing, market entry, market creation, all those follow-on stages. Industrial innovation policy will mean the government moving beyond simply the research stage into those later stages. And as I suggested earlier, historically, the U.S. has not done that on its non-defense side. So the U.S. has had a long history of industrial economic policy, where obviously numerous countries do the same thing, a series of supports for various sectors in the economy, including in agriculture through things like price controls or government-supported irrigation systems, in energy for things like hydropower, fossil fuel supports, renewable supports, in health through Medicare, obviously in transport infrastructure. These are traditional governmental interventions into kind of economic policy elements. In other words, they're supporting existing product lines, existing technologies. But industrial innovation policy, I would argue, really focuses on that innovation side itself. And as I've defined it, it is a governmental intervention into the post-research kinds of stages. There are three new drivers in the US driving these policies, and everyone in the room I know is familiar with these: a technology competition with China, climate change, and the pandemic. But there are barriers here to these new, more interventionist policies in the US, particularly the way in which we have organized our government support for R&D in the past has not extended beyond that research and early stage development phase. So that's a real barrier towards implementing a new round of industrial innovation policies. And of course, there's a new geopolitical driver. We're moving towards a new international system, which will be the discussion here today. It obviously has great consequences for innovation policy. To a significant extent, a deglobalization is underway, I think driven initially by a recognition of the demands of coping with the COVID pandemic, but older ideas on organizing industry, things like just-in-time inventory and core competency, I think are being replaced by newer ideas around resiliency and more vertically integrated firms. And we're now in another period where democratic governments appear to be challenged by autocratic governments. It's an unstable situation. There are 6 major new US policies that have developed between 2020 and 2022. And I'd like to, that mark a dramatic sea change, an advent really of new industrial innovation policies in the US. The first of these we called Operation Warp Speed. It was the effort to rapidly develop and deploy vaccines. Perhaps the most important of these 6 different elements: dramatic governmental intervention to rapidly develop and deploy vaccines. The CHIPS Act, which many of you are familiar with, was an attempt to restore, to the extent possible, some US semiconductor leadership. US output of semiconductor chips into the global economy, its production has now fallen to a 12% level. It was in the 36% range, a decade before. So a deep concern on the national security side in particular. A major infrastructure bill passed in 2021. It created a lot of traditional transportation infrastructure, but also a whole new kind of infrastructure for energy technologies, for carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, critical minerals, renewables. That was a $20 billion effort that is fully funded, and a whole new program has been created within our Department of Energy, a technology demonstration office to demonstrate and implement these technologies. There's been an effort in the White House, really led by the pandemic problems that the U.S. ran into on pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical ingredients. But the White House has a plan really looking at supply chains and their strength around the pharmaceutical issues, around advanced batteries, around critical minerals, and around semiconductors. And that includes both assistance on financing as well as supply chain rebuilding. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which many in this room are familiar with, was the first really large-scale effort by the United States to deal with climate change. And this has funded $375 billion for new energy and climate technology challenges. It's not simply research. There's a lot of support for applied technology. And finally, and I'll talk about this in a minute, legislation that's called the CHIPS and Science Act. I mentioned the CHIPS Act, but the science part I'll focus on in a minute, that authorized a whole new round of applied science programs. So let me do quick several case studies. Operation Warp Speed. In this case, the federal government picked a series of companies in 4 different vaccine technology areas and supported those companies by guaranteed contracts that enabled them to undertake production well before their vaccines were actually approved by our Federal Drug Agency, the Emergency Use Approval System. So this is picking winners. It's a top-down kind of approach. Electric vehicles, another case study. We all think that Tesla is the creation of Elon Musk, but the story is more complex. The government wanted to implement electric vehicles. It created a network of supporting incentive programs that were both at the federal level and at the state level. And that led to, frankly, major support for Tesla's evolution, which it took full advantage of. Any firm could have picked up these different incentive pieces, but Tesla was mobilized and organized to do so. And it's been key at many stages to Tesla's evolution, including saving it from bankruptcy in the post-2009 period. So these are 2 different models that the U.S. is exploring for industrial innovation policy, this top-down model, such as through Operation Warp Speed, and this bottom-up approach, setting out a menu of incentives that firms could potentially take advantage of. A third case study is on this CHIPS and Science Act. I'll just summarize it very briefly, but the concern here is that U.S. technology history was littered with technologies that were innovated in the United States that did not scale up in the United States and got produced abroad, with obviously some of the economic consequences I discussed earlier. The legislation identifies 10 critical technology areas for R&D, but really applied focus at the bastion of U.S. basic science, our National Science Foundation. So it's adding a whole applied technology wing to our traditional basic research agency. There are gaps in these 6 initiatives. Scale-up financing is a major gap. We haven't really addressed the funding, the financing of the scale-up process. We haven't adequately addressed support for the manufacturing stage. Unless these technologies can be manufactured, they're not going to be implemented. And then there's a big issue of cross-agency collaboration in the U.S. We have a plethora of independent R&D organizations organized around particular missions. A lot of these agencies are going to have to collaborate if these technologies are going to be moved. So is the U.S. entering a new era of industrial innovation policy? I think this has begun. There has been bipartisan support for virtually all of these initiatives. It's going to require completely new thinking and skills by our traditional U.S. science base at the agencies that are going to be required to implement it. They're going to have to learn these new systems from science, not just science research, but understanding the production side. So for these programs to work, which are large scale, we're going to need a new infrastructure for industrial innovation policy. We're going to need change agents that have the skill sets to be able to lead these efforts. We're going to need connections across these research institutions. We're going to need to rebuild U.S. manufacturing foundations. We're going to need to understand the whole mapping process for supply chain and how to fill supply chain gaps better than we do. We're going to need technology testing and demonstration, a whole new effort at how do you accelerate technology introduction through technology certification. We're going to need flexible contracting mechanisms. We need to apply government procurement programs to acquire the output of some of these technologies, at least some of them. And we're going to need particularly this technology scale-up financing, which remains a gap. So there are underlying issues here that this conference will be focused on. U.S. national security is deeply tied to rebuilding U.S. manufacturing. Technology leadership drives national security leadership, and manufacturing is the crossroads between national security and economic security. The three are very, very interdependent. And that's really, I think, being perceived now, finally, in the United States. Obviously, there's great controversy here in Korea over a $7,500 buyer credit for electric vehicles that passed in the recent Inflation Reduction Act that passed in August. The EU and Korea are looking at that as GATT violative. There's practical questions in that legislation itself that are being asked in the US. The US automotive sector has argued that that credit is not available to 70% of the electric vehicles now in the US market, and 40% don't meet the battery sourcing requirement. So the practical foundations of this legislation are somewhat problematic. But in a larger sense, US manufacturing and US technology development is not large enough for the US to go this alone. I don't think this realization is widespread at this point in the United States, but I think it will come to this. The US is going to have to adopt what I think we could call a strategic orientation to this technology sovereignty issue that is going to require it to be more engaged and more independent with clusters of other nations. So I think this conference is particularly timely in raising those issues. Thank you.
Can I see my PowerPoint? Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much. Again, it's my extreme pleasure to be able to share my perspective, which I call Korean perspective, in the midst of intensifying US-China competition in tech hegemony. Well, let me start by showing these pictures, which was showing late June, I guess, in NATO summit. There was a lot of attentions, of course, naturally given to what's going on in Ukraine. And it looks like this scene is, you see on the top right, is very common, thing. So Zelensky wearing T-shirts and making speech. This may be last time you want to see me live. So that's sort of an historic turnaround. But what is happening at Madrid was 4 so-called Asian Pacific countries were invited to NATO, which has originally nothing to do with Asia Pacific. An important thing is the Korean new government is finding its place in NATO summit. And at the end of the conference summit, they concluded adopted so-called strategic concept, and for the first time NATO, they identified China as complex challenge. And that is a natural introduction to intensifying US-China competition. And of course, this is Act 2. Act 1 is opened by Donald Trump versus Xi Jinping. Act 2 is between Biden and Xi Jinping. And Biden, from his day one, he ordered to reconfigure global supply chain of some critical product. So that is related to conference we are taking today, how to attain technological sovereignty in key sectors. The key sector Biden government identified was 4 products: semiconductor, electric vehicle battery, and important key material including rare earth element and bioproduct. Within 100 days, the government, Biden administration, come up with solutions. Solution is, as my previous speakers, Mr. Von Billion, he mentioned so-called industrial innovation policy. So as an economist, we spent early days by criticizing industrial policy, how bad, how it is going to hamper efficiency, but now here we are. And it's quite natural if you are at White House, if you're looking at commanding height, who is controlling commanding height? Obviously, it's not US, it's some other country. So they want to regain commanding height. And also, 3 years ago, Director of National Intelligence, Daniel Kos, as he presented his view on Senate Intelligence Committee, his view was someone on this one simple graph, which is showing gap between US and China in technically sensitive industrial sectors, excepting aircraft is closing in. So it is naturally causing concern. I think this is a second so-called Sputnik moment. And ever since, no matter who is in the White House, whether it is a Republican or a Democrat, I think they're all eyeing on China. So China, according to US administration and technological expert, is biggest ideological geopolitical threat facing the US, and which means what is happening in front of our eyes is not likely to be reversed. So we are deep into new era, and all the days where Chinese speakers in this forum, actually a lot of Chinese speakers came to K-Fest and spoke in front of Korean students and global leaders, where rising of China is good for you. We are a communist country, but we are seeking peaceful rise. And Washington believed, and the place in China global trading system will secure their transition toward the so-called right path. But all that is now in basket case. And it is mainly because, unlike to many believe, unlike to many view of scientists and scholars, looks like a party is controlling technology. We thought it is going to be private sector. They are at driver's seat, who will decide, who will dictate future of technology. But in case of China, it looks like it's a party. And a lot of you've been to China, and I think you had sharing common experience like me. If you lost your passport, within a few hours, they will get a secure passport. It is because they are deep learning, AIs, and so on and so forth. So they coin new word, that is digital Leninism, and they are exporting and spreading to all of the universe. And that means if technology is going to be available by all of us, that is going to lead more liberal society, more peaceful country, but we are living very different, opposite of this utopia. And as it turns out, competition between US and China, especially in technology, is not just 1 year old, it's some years old, ever since the first year of Donald Trump administration adopted so-called national security strategy. They clearly identified rise of China is threatening security of US and security of US economic life. And all these alarm bells are ringing wide. And the case of Huawei is a very devastating case. If US determined it has capacity and intention to go all the way to break a company. So Huawei, rise and downfall of Huawei is a very, very interesting case. So that means in some key technology sectors where US is still taking the commanding height in terms of designs and R&D, for instance, semiconductor, I think it is still, the game is in favor of USA. But on the other hand, something like electric vehicle battery, I think game is rather different. So whether or not US can be very successful in reconfiguring global supply chain to their favor is open-ended question. I'd like to put that to discussions amongst us. So what is happening, especially since the outbreak of pandemic, country after country, they were given a lot of time to figure out how we can decrease reliance on so-called untrustworthy partner. So reshoring, nearshoring, friend-shoring, ally-shoring, all sort of shoring. But US is pursuing reshoring into soil of US, but their problem is they cannot do by their own companies. It is mainly because, as my previous speakers mentioned, US is lacking manufacturing power base and the base to scale up, even though they maintain and they occupy the early stage of all this production cycle, like R&D innovation, but somehow scale up is a very different story. So because of it, they tend to rely on so-called like-minded and value-sharing democratic countries, and that's where Korea is finding ourselves. So when Biden was visiting Korea this spring, his first visit was a semiconductor factory in Korea, Samsung Electronics. And also when the chairman of SK, when he was visiting Washington and making huge pledge, we'll increase our bet on electric vehicle battery in the USA. Biden couldn't attend meeting, but he was greeting and he was wholeheartedly. But as it turns out, it is quite risky. So that is, I call American risk, because while US is interested in securing Korea sport, Taiwan sport, and Japanese sport, and European sport, but the politicians, they are mindfully aiming re-elections, and their mindset is only two years ahead. And so it looks like, between administration and politics, I don't see any effective coordinations. That I call American risk. That is risk of populism under democratic regime. So which means a country like Korea, even if Korea is happen to occupy some key chain of production, but we are facing two insurmountable risks. One is China risk, which has been out there for a long time, and we know how it is. But businessmen, they ignore China risk still these days, and now they're facing American risk. So that is putting Korea in new different challenge. So it's quite obvious we're into new world. The old world, old normal, it is fading away. There was a huge firewall between trade and security. So which means even if you have some country under different political regime, you could trade, you could invest, and you could exchange, but that days are gone. It is because underlying presumption has been fundamentally shaken. Underlying presumption is a peaceful rise of China, and engagement and cooperation with China is going to put China right path. That right path is, from Washington's point of view and Western's point of view, China will converge to, even though it is going to be very slow, but eventually at the end of the day, history is going to be China is transforming from one party to plural party, and from authoritarian democracy, as they call, but less demeaning and soft authoritarianism, maybe eventually some element of democracy, as you can evidence in Singapore. So that has the peaceful transition of China in the mindset of Westerners. And also they were thinking at the end of the day, China is going to see more prospering private sector driving seat, government is going to take a back seat. And as it turns out, there has been a golden recipe, which is so China's 30 years hyper economic growth. But somehow it looks like China is taking a U-turn and reversing turn. and ever since emergence of Xi Jinping. So all the normal was basically through the 30 decades of hyperinflation, we were witnessing seamless global value chain. The one single example is Apple smartphone in Shenzhen. It is designed in California but assembled in China. But on the current system, you cannot imagine Steve Jobs is taking all this production scale in Shenzhen and rely on Chinese government mercy. It is unthinkable. But the mantra those times was just in time and cost efficiency. And looks like we are rapidly, suddenly moving into new emerging new normal. That is obviously firewall between trade and security was fading away, especially so-called key sectors. I think government and policymakers are discussing what is going to be key sectors, whether or not it is going to be narrow net or it is going to be wide net. That is something we need to discuss. And also as a result, the key was, and the most single dominant buzzword these days, global value chain. Obviously, even 4 years ago, 5 years ago, no one cares about global value chain because the global value chain is well and functioning. But looks like that they are not interested in just in time. They are more interested in just in case. And politicians and also businessmen, they're interested in securing control and securing resilience, ensuring the stability. So because of that, we are on the verge of witnessing, for the first time in past 3 decades, emergence of 2 possible different regional value chains, so to speak, in some key sectors. I think the first is definitely semiconductor, and second one is biochemical sectors, and third one is maybe in key raw materials. And electric vehicle, I have no confidence. I do not know whether or not it is going to be successful. So which means we're going to have less efficient value chain. But it looks like that's inevitable. And China has its own game plan. China tried to react by transforming its economy from world factory to world sectors. They rely on its G2 level economic size, and that is going to provide China some cushions. And so China wants to create China's version of so-called, the domestic market-driven value chain. Whether or not it is going to be successful is open-ended question. But one thing I can tell you is China will come up with its own version of value chain. Of course, it is not going to be effective. It is going to be low quality. But in this increasing divided world, in some key sectors, technology, and that is going to ensure Communist Party will be in control. It is going to get them moving for some decades along. And at the same time, China had game plan, so-called, which I call divide and rule, because I think a European country was their target, and they spent a lot of resources in coming to European countries and creating so-called 16+1 partnership, under which a lot of Central Eastern European countries was having some economic ties with Chinese countries, and then they were welcoming Chinese investment. That is about to be thing of past because of all this attitude shown by Chinese government and Chinese diplomat after outbreak of pandemic and increasing the power competition, also what is happening in Hong Kong democracy movement. Also, there was historic trade agreement between European Union and China, which they call a comprehensive agreement on investment, just on the eve of official declaration of pandemic. That was announced December 30th of 2020. And by achieving it, Beijing was firmly believed, even if US is pushing us to the corners, but we can divide and rule and we can secure our breathing room. But I think this CAI was now almost virtually dead in Brussels and Strasbourg. I do not know, but my European colleague, you can provide your own thought. But even if this is a very headwind against China's moving forward, I think they have 2 very important their own arsenals, weapons. Well, let me ask you these questions. Suppose international standard is going to be decided not by quality, not by market dominance, but by making one country is making one vote. Suppose you have 200 countries in this world. Then between US or Western standard and China standard, which standard will be accepted? Anyone who believes Western American standard is accepted by this UN National Solar Assembly, raise your hands. I see 1, 2, 3. Okay. Anyone who believes Chinese version is going to adopt it and something like UN National Assembly? Only purposely, which means a lot of people, they decide to not to vote. You see, this is the current state of thinking. That means no one is at controlling stage, and so-called bystanders and third parties, they are folding their arms and to see what's going on. And about 2 years ago, when I was opening this question, I was seeing so many hands rising to China's favor. Okay, so that is what we are living in. And I think at this point should be vividly cleared and conveyed to policymakers in Washington and policymakers Brussels, so that they can realize realities. I think that's the benefit of holding this sort of conference in Korea. Well, this is showing how China is facing, the headwinds. So all this favorable opinion which they helped to cultivate for decades is now gone because the act, not words, they have shown. But still question remain because as evidenced by my previous exercise, whether or not US can lead is subject to suspicion, if I use very harsh word, or subject to very open-ended questions, if I use mild word, because what they try to achieve on international arena is unlikely to be sustainable to many, and life cycle maybe 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. Then what's going to happen after that? And can they, a new incoming administration in US, they have enough consensus within US to move on? And even though consensus is, anything about China, that is open-ended question. It is mainly because to many people in this corner world, they have perceptions, despite all these, good words, but actions speak louder than words. That's what I learned from, our English conversation practice. So what is happening is, as evidenced by Inflation Reduction Act, despite their lack of production scaling up capacity, but they come up with that ridiculous, the regulations. Only product manufacturers, America, including some vicinity, is going to be eligible. And that is far from realities. But that has happened because they are conscious of elections. And all the action is speaking loud to domestic constituency. Well, it is not new. It has been US from the beginning all the time. But all early days, I'm going to argue, let's say 1960, 1970, that was, the US was holding commanding height. But now in this era where party and technology are deeply connected, and then there is questions whether or not US can effectively, successfully overcome domestic political constraint. So let me conclude by saying we are witnessing reconfiguration of two Silicon Valley. Some years ago, there were two Silicon Valleys competing and collaborating. One Silicon Valley is based in San Francisco Bay, my second home. I'm from the Berkeley and Stanford. But beauty and the reason why we have own Silicon Valley, or even two Silicon Valley in the world, is mainly because the attraction is offering. Mainly because anyone can dream about going from 0 to 1. But the problem is, because of many regulations in the USA, including human rights, they have difficulty of commercially making it to test bed. That test bed at massive scale and speed of light is happening in Asian Silicon Valley, Shenzhen. So as a result, we see it is not US company, it is not Korean company, which is controlling commercial drone. Take just one example. But even in that case, before outbreak of intensifying US-China power competition, technical hegemony, they were in collaborating competition. Once they recognize, well, this can be readily commercialized, then there was competition begin to aim for consumers' wallet. But now we see these days, China cannot come to Silicon Valley or European landscape for the purpose to buy and acquire new companies. So this transaction is almost blocked. And also, American minds or Western investors has difficulty of coming to China and try to secure their production base. So we increasingly seeing demarcations between two Silicon Valley. So that means the future is unlike the past we've been witnessing, less efficient but more concerned. I'm going to say more obsessed with controlling, and welcome to world of sovereignty, technology sovereignty. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much for the very informative, insightful presentation and thought-provoking ideas. Now it's turn to our designated discussant, Dr. Jung Chul.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this international forum. And I can't agree more with the three prominent speakers who gave us the fabulous presentations. So it's a tough task for me to discuss all the aspects of these presentations, but I'll give it a try. And I'd like to first share a few slides with you. Can you? Okay. So next page, please. So in this session, we are talking about maybe some causes and the effects of the U.S.-China competitive strategy competition, and I think this is one of the most important graph that shows the declining the U.S. manufacturing jobs and the rising the Chinese products penetration into the U.S. market. Next. Oh, here. Yeah, I have only a couple more. So, and then you can see the statistics from the global M&A and especially the Chinese M&A before the 2017 and after the 2017, how the dramatically changed. And global FDI downturn since the 2016. And especially Chinese investment into the U.S. and EU plummeted basically, and it is the sort of the beginning of this U.S.-China strategy competition. So, according to the Bill's presentation today, I think it's brilliant to divide this industrial policy into the economic and the innovation. I think that's very, very nice. So to me, it's like the mechanism is similar. It's like the picking winners, and but emphasis is different because the innovation puts more emphasis on the whole package, the manufacturing and the in more domestic market oriented. But my question is it sustainable? And he brought us the example, the case study of the Operation Warp Speed. So it's possible because it's like an emergency. But you cannot run a hospital only with the emergency, the rooms. And there's going to be a fatigue. It cannot be a long-term, solution. So right now, I understand the U.S. is going that path, and that kind of the industrial policy, aiming for the innovation and trying to enlarge the gap with the China. But how long and how effective can it be? Is the government replacing the entrepreneurship? I don't know. I mean, if that's the best strategy, I understand it's inevitable, according to the Bill's presentation and the President Che's presentation. But is it the right, the kind of game the U.S. wants to play with China? So I think that's one of the questions. And also, the U.S. is aiming for the ally shoring or something like that. But because the domestic politics dominating all the economic incentives, so already you're getting a lot of discontents from the allies. For example, in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, like $7,500 the tax credit for the electric vehicles, but it was already there, right? It's not a new one since the 2008 and 9. But now the some of the foreign electric vehicle producers are deprived of this tax credit because they are not assembled in the North America. So I think I'm not sure if that's the right way of doing that. It's kind of violating the international trade, the rules-based the market system. Is it a fair competition? I don't know. And the level playing field. These are words that the U.S. has been advocating, for a long time. And then I understand that there are some link between the production and technology. It's like the industrial commons, by the Gary Pisano, and so I understand there's a downside of the globalization because all the companies and the global value chains are market driven, not the policy driven, and so the companies do not consider the national security in terms of the when they are making decisions where they try to produce. So there's going to be a leakage of the technology, and also the lost opportunities to accumulate know-hows and human capital from the manufacturing process. So it's sort of the learning by producing effect. So I understand that there are some concerns on the manufacturing, all the outside the United States. There are some fears and so on, and especially the critical technology is very important for the future of the leadership. So the economic security and national security are on the line, and that's why there's some decoupling going on. I think but should all this kind of the policy take the whole package of all the activities like the research, development, prototype testing, and so on? Sounds like it's a way towards the self-sufficiency. And if the U.S., China is also using the circulation policy, but it's basically taking the inward-oriented the policies. So my question is that the trust is often emphasized to restore the confidence in the international system and the multilateral system, and the spirit of the cooperation, which is also crucial element for a way forward. But I do not see these kind of the other things together. So, I mean the going back to the the President choice question about standards. He didn't get a lot of votes. Why? Because I didn't vote either. Because he didn't give me the choices that I wanted. Because there's not going to be one. It's going to be bifurcated standards. That's my answer. So I didn't have that answer, so I didn't vote, for example. So it's going to be so we are talking about the decoupling, but we all know that the full-blown decoupling is not even possible, even to the United States. How can U.S. ask the allies to do that? So I think the future is, for some time, the bifurcated economy and the global supply chain is going to be sort of the bifurcated, like in the standard. So in order to save some time, I'd like to just present a couple of the other questions. So what is the end game of the U.S.-China strategy competition? Competitive coexistence, is it a possible, the end? And then, if it's the bifurcated economy, for some time, so markets are going to be segregated, and the China, the President Choi mentioned that the China from the world factory to the world market, world consumer. But can China do this without the reserve currency like the U.S. dollar? U.S. has been doing this the world market, as played the role of the world market. But I don't know. That's my one of my questions. So seems like the one of the problems with the China brought out to the world economy was the state capitalism and coercive diplomacy. And maybe it could change. So my last comment is that I think there should be a balance and a combination of international innovation policy, industrial innovation policy, and international cooperation. And maybe we need a new international institutions, maybe around the like-minded countries who share common values, like democracy, maybe market system, and so on. But it may be less universal than in the past, so that forcing China to make a decision to join or not, rather than cornering allies into the choice dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung. Very thoughtful comments and very tough question you raised. So shall we start with the giving chance to our speakers to quick response to the comments, question? Then I open the floor and collect the question from audience. Okay. First, who's gonna go first?
I can respond briefly. Will the United States be able to pull this strategy off? I'm going to answer like an economist. Time will tell, right? We'll see, right? The challenges are intense, and obviously the U.S. is overwhelmingly reliant on a free market system, both within the country and abroad, and it's not going to shift away from that in very, very abrupt transitions. I note, for example, that although the Trump administration imposed, a whole series of tariffs on Chinese goods, the U.S. trade deficit with China only expanded during the COVID period. And the U.S. deficit in advanced technology goods moved from $130 billion in 2019 to about $195 billion this past year. So have those policies had any significant effect? The data doesn't tell us that they have. So I think you're absolutely correct that there's going to be a long transition period here as we attempt to adjust. And frankly, there's time, and I'd like to encourage, the scholars here and the experts here and the experts in Korea to really think about what a strategic technology sovereignty ought to look like. Because I don't think the United States knows where it's headed. It's got some rough ideas, and as you pointed out, this is very much driven by domestic politics, which have been extremely disruptive in recent years. And with no real sign of immediate stability coming about, frankly, a very disruptive upcoming midterm election and another national election 2 years after that. So that political divisiveness is going to be with us for some time. And that is driven by this underlying social disruption that I talked about earlier, which is definitely pushing United States politicians towards, we could say, plain technology sovereignty in an autonomy kind of version. But it is so much in US's long-term interest to move that into a strategic approach in a collaborative way with other countries that I think eventually will arrive at that policy. But there's a very important role for Korea and for the EU and for other traditional collaborative players with the US to help design that strategy. So I think your point about the need for a new institutional look here is an important one.
Yeah, perhaps I can follow. Well, thank you very much for your insightful, incisive comment. Let me present 3 points. First of all, I don't agree with what you're saying, the past globalization market-driven. Well, that is a very phenomenal aspect. So what I'm going to say is, as past 3 decades of so-called hyper-globalization is designed by US and West on board, and I think, future phase of globalization, I'm not also, agreeing with many people saying deglobalization, and we're going to see new phase globalization. It's not going to be solely designed by the US. It's going to be designed with different mindset, with the US on one corners and China, and maybe whether or not, the middle power can be on board. That is open-ended questions. It is mainly because when I was coming to Geneva and Washington to negotiate telecom rule, I cannot forget how determined US administrations to open up global financial market. And the flag of, the free financial flow is good for the global society. The US administration was leading that role. And also we all understand how, I should say, ruthless they were, taking advantage of 1997 Asian financial crisis to open up those financial sectors under the flagship of free flow financial capital is going to improve efficiency and furthermore get rid of corruptions and enhance global governance. Now, back in 3 decades, anyone who has verified, tested that tenet and that dogma has, the sustainable. So, I think what has happening is quite different. And now we are seeing a new phase of globalization, and that is the past globalization is synonymous with one seamless global value chain, maybe starting with the Silicon Valley and going through the Korea and the Europe and Taiwan, and ending in China. But new phase of globalization, we're going to witness some 2 or 3, some regional value chain in key sectors. That's what we're going to design, what we're going to create. So here we see the clash of will and incentive between politician and businessmen, and also possibly we can play a certain role in making sure this is not going to disrupt too much. So I think too much mindless obsession with efficiency is not going to be helpful. As an economist, I was always, feeling how role economics is playing to make a world safe and better and prosperous society. Because in our own research room and classroom, somehow economists, we develop bad habit of emphasizing too much efficiency, turn out to be static efficiency. And what is happening in reality is an ordinary person, they don't understand economic logic and they don't care about comparative advantage, but they are always constantly aware, at least one thing. If I stay alive, I should have my own comparative edge. That may not be related to comparative advantage. That may be related to absolute advantage. But as the Deputy Minister Jung mentioned, I should have something irreplaceable talent. So that irreplaceable is going to mean someone irreplaceable by China, irreplaceable by America. This is the irreplaceable AI, irreplaceable by robot. So there is a whole totally new world. That is something I can emphasize. And second point is, well, I run my mock exercise, asking open-ended questions. Suppose we have UN-like a system, one country, one voting, then which standard you're going to take a vote. Well, the exercise is very simple because I'm not going. I was telling aloud. It is not decided by efficiency. It is not decided by market logic alone, politics. So, question is how U.S. and West were successful in really taking care of mindset of all those like-minded countries. That is an open-ended question, and that may be very few. That is not going to be majority. I can absolutely tell you. Maybe Professor Son may have different view, but it is not going to be majority. If you decide majority, then you see a lot of absent vote. So that is related to third point. So while new fragmented value chain is going to emerge, and also U.S. is showing by words and actions you should take side. Okay, you should invest in the USA, but very reluctant to provide more generous incentive to like-minded country. Then here the question is, can it create coalition among middle powers, such as can it have some coalition among Korea, Japan, and European Union on the same boat? Is Brussels thinking that way? Is Tokyo thinking that way? I'm not quite sure. Based on my months and the moments of dialogue with them, they don't think Korea is on their peer, even though we Koreans believe we are to the peers. And also, I don't think Korean government is, whether it is a right wing or left wing, they don't really believe we have to create coalition of middle powers, and our political landscape, economic landscape should stretch it to the east, to the Tokyo, to the west, to Brussels. I don't think it is any place in the map. If you have different view, please tell me. Let me know. Thank you.
As I said earlier, the two-way, the simultaneous interpretation available. So anyone we will have a question, you can speak Hangugo or Korean. If we want to prefer to speak French or Chinese, perhaps that will put our interpreter into big trouble. But and also any participant in the online, also please send a text email message to us. We're happy to collect your questions. Okay, any question from the floor? Let me check. Yes, please.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for your insightful messages. My name is Hyun-Hak Cho. I'm from the Ministry of Science and ICT. So my question is, what will be the future of existing multinational organizations? Dr. Chung has mentioned the possibility for a new multinational organization to sort of facilitate these processes, and also Professor Bombilian also mentioned about the shift from the industrial economic policy to industrial innovation policy, which might be conflicting with existing trade organizations and economic organizations like a WTO. And a lot of the companies and also international global economies, countries has been abiding to the rules of trade rules such as WTO and subsidies and countervailing measures, and also to some extent to a detrimental effect. There has been a lot of the the tariffs and also a lot of fines that has been put on the companies. And this recent sort of availability of subsidies and also abundant the monies going into the companies as a sort of supporting them and into the industries. Do you think this means sort of the free ticket to the companies and also the sort of the free pass for the governments to increase the subsidies, which might be conflicting to the the free market rules that has been ruling the global economies for a while?
Thank you very much. Related to the question, I also thinking about when the Director Von William described the U.S. Industry innovation policy, that reminds me of what Chinese government have been doing in the past decades. There was giving impression that there's some little convergence between two great power in terms of innovation policy. So what is the similarity and the difference between two countries in terms of innovation policy, and what's the U.S. Strengths, relative strengths, or competitive edge over Chinese one?
네, 제가 사전에 어쨌든 그 지정 토론할 때는 영어로 하고 그 이렇게 토론할 때는 한국말로 하겠다고 말씀을 드려서 지금은 한국말로 답을 하겠습니다. 그 사실 제가 그 토론할 때 말씀드렸던 그 new institution은 꼭 국제기구만을 의미하는 건 아니고요. 국제기구도 있고 그다음에 뭐 새로운 어떤 제도 내지는 또 우리 그 최병일 그 총장님이 하셨던 무슨 어떤 그 fragmented 그런 그 value chain 뭐 이런 것들을 포함하는 어떤 그런 얘기였던 것 같고요. 사실 그 저 동의하는 게 사실 막 보조금을 주고 이런 그런 industrial policy에서의 뭐 텍스 크레딧이라는 이름으로 사실상 보조금을 주고 하는 것들이 어떻게 보면 그걸 그 오픈이 이제 완전히 그런 그 세상이 열린 게 아닌가 하는 부분이고, 사실 이거는 당장은 예를 들면 그 미국 같은 경우도 이런 식으로 했을 때 bring back the jobs to the the United States, but only for the time being. It's like the racing to the bottom 인 거잖아요, 그죠? 그래서 아무튼 저는 하여튼 그런 부분에 대해서는 그래서 우리가 좀 깊게 생각을 해야 되는데, 일단 그 coalition among middle powers doubtful. 저도 거기에 대해서는 별로지 않은데, 왜냐하면 한국이나 이런 미들 파워 국가들은 종속 변수라고 저는 생각을 합니다. 사실 얼마나 많은 그 policy space가 있을지, 사실 우리 그 차관보님께서 오늘 또 이렇게 유난히 그 천천히 조심스럽게 이렇게 단어 선택을 하면서 말씀을 하시는데, 원래 그 클로즈 도어 미팅 할 때는 굉장히 더 이렇게 오픈하게 하시는데 하여튼 좀 그 이해는 하는데, 아무튼 그 아까 말씀하셨던 그 안보에 필요한 기술을 누가 결정하냐? 우리는 물론 우리나라에서는 한국이 결정할 수 있죠. 다만 한국이 결정하는 거 말고 미국이 결정한 거에 대해서도 우리도 디펜던트하게 그 종속적으로 따라갈 수밖에 없는, 우리가 그런 경제 구조를 갖고 있잖아요. 사실 우리가 셀프 서피션트 할 수 없는 이제 그런 부분을 우리가 생각을 해야 된다. 그래서 저는 아까 뭐 파티 말씀을 하실 때도 아주 공감을 하는 거고, 앞으로도 물론 계속적으로 미들 파워 뭐 라이크 마인디드 컨트리들의 역할을 막 얘기하겠지만 실제로 크게 기대하기는 어렵다. 결국은 미국, 중국, 그다음에 EU 같은 경우 우리가 이제 독일하고 다른 점 뭐예요? 독일은 EU라는 큰 그 블록 안에 있지만 한국은 어디 있어요? RCEP? I don't know. RCEP could do anything really about that. Yeah.
I can add a point about the similarities between, China and the U.S. that you were making earlier. U.S. industrial innovation policy is, aside from the historic defense role, is really at the early stages. So, just to make one comparison with where China is, obviously China's focus has really been on applied technology development and manufacturing. That has not been the U.S. focus. So, for example, in scale-up financing, China has a system of some 60 industrial guidance funds, which are private sector led. They're equity investments driven by government suggestions about what advanced technologies need support. These 60 funds currently have approximately $1.6 trillion in authorized funding, of which about close to $1 trillion has been committed. The U.S. has no comparable scale-up mechanism. Nothing close to those kinds of numbers. I mean, the CHIPS Act, which the United States considers an enormous commitment, is $52 billion, which frankly probably underestimates the level of commitment the U.S. is going to have to make if it really wants to build a significant additional fab capacity in the U.S. Given the level of support that other countries, including Korea, including Taiwan, have made to, constructing fabs. So the U.S. is only starting to kind of dabble in this. A recent report from a U.S. think tank called CSIS has estimated that China's annual industrial subsidies to industrial scale-up are approximately $450 billion a year. So that contrasts with even the major commitment in the United States to new energy technology implementation of, several $100 billion. So, and that's a 10-year number. So the United States is not even in the game yet for the level of industrial subsidies that China is providing. So there's a recognition in the United States that's allowed its applied side and it's allowed its connectedness to weaken. But that's going to be a gradual corrective process and it's going to emerge over time. If indeed the existing commitments can be sustained. Can they be? Will these challenges alter? I don't think China's industrial policies are going to change anytime soon. Those are fundamental to the growth of the state as planned. So that's going to be there long term. That technology challenge is going to be there long term. The national security aspects are only worsening. On the pandemic front, the United States public has been assuming, we had an influenza epidemic in 1919. We had, a coronavirus epidemic in, 2019, 2020. We have another 100 years. But we don't. We now understand that infectious diseases are going to be a much more frequent occurrence given global connectedness, given global population increases. This is going to be a driver as well that's going to be pushing concerns about supply chains and technology advances and preparedness. And then obviously climate change is truly an international issue. And I think that's the ripe territory to really explore a better system of international collaboration on the technology development side. So these three challenges aren't going to go away. They'll continue to drive US politics, but also politics elsewhere. And I think all of our economies are going to have to adjust to these things.
Well, I think U.S. policy is increasingly similar to Chinese, unilateral, and also very dogmatic, and doesn't care economic expertise view. But nonetheless, I think there are fundamental change. Fundamental change is one system is immune to criticism outside. But one system, I think it has, at least for the time being, I say for the time being, capacity to self-correct. So it is sensitive to public opinion, include academic society, what we are discussing, and at least today are showing attitude of listening carefully, and also the fierce discussions and free press and civil society. I think that is, the very important demarcation point between one system versus another. But whether or not this, demarcation point is going to survive 2024 elections, I have less confidence. Sorry to say, but my American friends will attest to what I'm saying. And responding to previous questions, I appreciate your questions. What is the future of existing international organizations? Doomed. Well, as far as WTO is concerned, it is doomed, as we all know, because mainly two reasons. It is irrelevant, because WTO, when I was negotiating for WTO in 1990s, we are negotiating for the future trading rule, but one thing we couldn't foresee was dawning of digital era, and current trading rule has nothing to do with the digital commerce. And what is happening is China and US and European Union, all they try to vying to, the create commanding side of digital trade. So if something, WTO is successful in creating the global trading rule on digital commerce, I think they can be relevant. But chance was given for several years, but they still, showing very dismal performance. But more significant is, despite the small fishes and the middle fish, they very concerned about WTO rule when it comes to anti-dumping subsidy. Big fish, they don't care. Anti-dumping and subsidy, they couldn't care less. So that means that WTO, it is impossible to adjudicate dispute because adjudication system broken. But why I'm saying it is doomed when it comes to the future, but still some standard setting organization like WIPO and ITU, I think they are standing there quite relevant. And then the important thing is delivery mechanism, WIPO and WTO was standard setting organization. It is basically one country on board, and I think that is not related to, or I should say less related to market efficiency and market prevalence. So I think still my exercise is relevant. Thank you.
Yes. More question or comments from the floor? Yes.
예. 저는 한국의 그 과학기술 정책 연구하는 기관에서 근무하고 있는 사람입니다. 본 빌리언 박사님께 그 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 그 앞에 설명하실 때 그 미국 정부의 연구개발 예산에 대한 지원이 국방 분야와 이제 다른 분야로 구분이 되는데, 국방 분야는 상당히 이제 TRL 끝 단계까지 지원하는 데 반해 다른 분야는 이제 초기 단계를 지원한다고 말씀하셨습니다. 제가 알기로는 그 미국의 정부의 R&D 예산이 상당히 국방 분야에 대한 비중이 굉장히 크고 거의 절반 가까이 지원하는 걸로 알고 있는데, 정말 이 국방 분야의 그 연구개발 지원이 정말 국방과 안보와 직접적으로 연관된 그 분야에만 지원을 하는지, 아니면은 좀 그렇게 스트릭트하게 뭐 하여튼 판단하기보다는 조금 더 좀 폭넓게 굉장히 좀 간접적인 어떤 그런 그 관련이 있는 그런 산업 분야까지 포함해서 상당히 그 TRL 끝단까지 이런 산업 혁신 활동을 할 수 있도록 이렇게 지원을 하는 건지가 궁금합니다. 거기에 대해서 좀 답변을 듣고 싶습니다.
네, 좋습니다. 저도 한국말로 이 질문이 미국 우리 교수님 박사님에 대해서 다른 한국 패널한테 도움이 되는 질문을 하나 하는데, 아까 전에 최 박사님께서 그 글로벌 서플라이 체인 그리고 여러 가지 테크놀로지 관련돼서 아메리카 리스크, 차이나 리스크를 이야기했는데, 우리 한국 발표자님께 이 리스크를 어떻게 매니지할 수 있는 구체적 방법에 대해서 조금 더 듣고 싶습니다. 물론 몇 가지 아이디어를 던졌지만 제가 좀 푸시해서 이 리스크를 관리한 한국의 입장에서 이 리스크를 관리하는 방법, 가령 국제 공조 인터내셔널 코어퍼레이션에서 저희가 만약에 미국 뭐 일지만 이 다자 체제, 가령 ROK, EU, US 우리가 3자 트라이레터럴 스트레이지ክ 다이얼로그를 한다든지, 그러니까 트레이드 테크놀로지 카운슬 만드는지, 좀 ROK, 뭐 EU, US 사이언스 파트너십을 한다든지, 뭐 이런 방법으로 해서 뭔가 리스크를 매니지할 수 있는 또 다른 게 있는지 좀 의견을 더 듣고 싶습니다.
Do you want me to? I'll start in response to your good question. It's really all about the dimensions of the U.S. defense innovation system versus the non-defense innovation system. In fact, defense R&D is not the dominant player in the U.S. It once was. Obviously, during the Cold War, it was. but that has changed significantly. So just one example, defense research and development as opposed to later stage applied work towards systems is about $12 billion a year. That compares with just, our largest R&D agency, which is the National Institutes of Health, that's close to $40 billion a year. So DoD's role in this system is not what it was 30 or 40 years ago. Now, the US relied on this defense innovation system to launch a series of major innovation waves. It launched much of aviation advances, it launched much of space advances, obviously nuclear power, much of computing, the internet. All these came out of the defense innovation system, but they were definitely related to very specific national security needs. So there was a spillover to the broader economy in many of these areas, particularly in computing and the internet. But in effect, a dual use capability came about as a result of these, but they were focused on meeting national security needs. So will electric vehicles be a national security need? Unlikely. The Defense Department of the United States is not going to take that on. So this whole suite of climate-related technologies is going to fall into territories of other agencies in the US. The whole suite of pandemic and biohealth and pharmaceutical technologies is going to fall into other shoulders than the Defense Department. So just with these two things, much of the innovation system has really shifted away from a DoD focus. So that's why it's so significant that the US non-defense sector is starting to adopt and move towards more applied technology pickup. Have they developed all the tools in areas like manufacturing, interagency collaboration, technology scale up to be able to do this? Not yet. And that's my answer earlier. We'll see if these agencies develop that capability in cooperation with the private sector.
파이널 워드를 우리 최병일 총장님께 드리기 위해서 제가 아주 짧게만 그 리스크 매니지먼트 관련해서는 사실 우리 조기 경보 시스템이란 걸 다양한 국가들하고 만드는 게 하나 있고요. 근데 그걸 제대로 하려고 하면 또 그 다양한 소통 채널들을 잘 유지하는 게 필요하다. 그러니까 우리가 그동안 구축해놓은 FTA 네트워크라든가 뭐 이런 하여튼 그 외에도. 근데 사실 그 제가 볼 때 최병일 그 총장님께서 얘기하셨던 그 아메리카 리스크, 차이나 리스크 저는 이렇게 봅니다. 그러니까 이게 중국으로부터와의 경쟁에서 우리가 막 살아남아야 되는 부분들이 있잖아요. 근데 사실 우리가 국제 협력을 얘기하지만 미국 회사들하고의 경쟁도 훨씬 치열해질 가능성이 있다. 지금의 이런 미국의 그 인더스트리얼 팔러시나 이런 것들을 보면 그래서 한국 기업이 결국은 미국 기업들과의 경쟁에서도 또 살아남는 방법을 찾아야 되지 않는가 저는 그런 생각을 합니다.
Well, the question was not given to me, so I don't think I have to respond to the question. But if I try to make some contribution to the thought, I think, as we are open to say, the firewall between trade and security is long gone, and government is the driver's seat. But that is posing another risk because technical bureaucrat like the Mr. Zhang, they have their own incentive system, and also they have their own way to promote themselves. And what is happening is to manage. I'm not going to use minimize risk. To manage this risk, obviously, a matter principle, it prompt effective and sustainable and sustained discussion and dialogue between government and business sectors. But while I was negotiating early 1990s, I was always puzzled because Korean business never come to government to say, I have this problem and that problem with particular government. Now, after years and years of my career, I realize why that's the case. Because business is afraid of exposing their problem to the government because they're afraid that may be used against them. And this day, they're afraid they may be used against them on multiple purpose. So there is the almost insurmountable barrier to make happen between candid dialogue between government and business. I do not know. The case of Germany is a different story. Germany is very successful in creating some clusters. So I think, unless something is happening in this, what you're discussing is long on talk, short in action. So which means we should come up with different mechanism, and so our thinking should be very hard. Well, I like to say, concluding in my part, what is happening in U.S.-China and tech hegemony competition, that is awakening to rethink important, significant manufacturing sectors. Look, while all this discussion says manufacturing is not important drive economy because contribution GDP is a maximum 30%, 20%, maybe UK less than 10%. All advanced economies, they are driven by service sectors and finance content. But I think that economic indicate sheer mindful obsession with how much is GDP, how much job is created by manufacturing sectors are going to miss very important realities. I think this is a rediscovery of significance of manufacturing.
Thank you, Rich. We are already over on the show. We're out of time, so thank you. I think it's a really good start. Paved the way for the more interesting and constructive discussion for afternoon session. So thank you very much, all the participants and audience. Bye.